You know exactly how testimony service feels. Someone stands up and the room leans in, and they tell the story, the diagnosis that reversed, the marriage that was saved at the last moment, the job offer that came the day before the account hit zero, the night they cried out and felt something shift in the room. And the congregation responds, and you respond with them, because the story is real, because God moving for someone you know is worth celebrating. But somewhere underneath the celebration, something in you gets very quiet, because you're calculating. You're running through your own years, looking for the equivalent, the moment you could stand up and say, and then God did this. And the calculation keeps coming back the same way. You have years of showing up, of praying, of choosing faithfulness when unfaithfulness would have been easier. But you don't have the moment, the specific, undeniable, this couldn't have been anything else moment that testimony service is built for. And the longer you sit in that room, listening to stories that aren't yours, the more a question forms that you don't want to finish. If God shows up for everyone, why don't I have a story? You've never said it out loud, because saying it feels like accusation, because saying it feels like it might reveal something true. That the absence of the testimony isn't coincidence, that it's information about your faith, about your access, about whether you belong in the category of people God intervenes for. And you've been carrying that quietly. Every testimony service, every Sunday someone's story made the room cry. You clapped and went home, still with nothing specific to point to. Here's what makes it harder than it looks. You're not someone who stopped trying. You didn't drift. You didn't walk away. You didn't give God a reason to withhold. You've been faithful in the ordinary ways that don't make good stories. You showed up when it was inconvenient. You gave when it cost you something. You chose patience when impatience would have felt more honest. You prayed the prayers. You read the chapters. You sat in the services. And you watched people around you, people who seem to carry their faith more lightly than you carry yours, walk into the specific moments that became testimonies. And you got the ordinary, the unremarkable continuation of a life that God seems to be quietly maintaining rather than dramatically interrupting. And you try to be okay with that. And you believe those things, but they don't quite reach the specific ache of sitting in testimony service with nothing to say, of being the person who has been at this longer than almost anyone, and having the least to show for it in the format the room values. The shame of that is specific, not the shame of failure, the shame of faithfulness that didn't produce visible evidence. Here's something almost no one says about testimonies. They are a selection. The stories that get told in testimony service are the ones that fit the format. Dramatic, specific, before and after, problem and resolution. They are the category of God's activity that translates into a 3-minute story with a clear climax. And there is an entire category of God's activity that never makes it into testimony service. Not because it's less significant, because it doesn't have the right shape. The grace that held you together during the year, everything was hard without a single dramatic moment. The peace that arrived gradually instead of all at once. The slow, invisible strengthening of a faith that was quietly being made more durable. The provision that came regularly in ordinary ways instead of miraculously at the last moment. The way you didn't break when you should have. The way the ordinary days added up into a life that is more than the sum of its unremarkable moments. None of that gets told on Sunday morning. Not because God wasn't in it, because the format doesn't have a category for it. And the absence of your story in the testimony service is not evidence of God's absence from your life. It's evidence that what God has been doing in your life doesn't fit the format. That's not a deficit. That's a different kind of story. What if the testimony you don't have is more significant than the ones you've been hearing? Because here's what the dramatic testimony requires. A crisis. A before, something that had to go wrong in order for God to visibly intervene in the right direction. And most dramatic testimonies, when you trace them back, started with something breaking. The marriage that was saved at the last moment first had to reach the last moment. The diagnosis that reversed first had to be the diagnosis. The provision that came the day before zero first had to get to the day before zero. The testimony required the crisis. And you have been spared certain crises. Not because God hasn't been with you, possibly because God has been with you in ways that prevented the breaking point that the testimony would have required. The testimony you don't have might be the life that didn't fall apart, the marriage that never reached the last moment because something held it earlier, the health that didn't require a miracle because something was quietly maintained, the finances that never hit zero because provision came steadily instead of dramatically. Those aren't the absence of God's work. They might be evidence of its consistency, of a presence so constant that intervention never became necessary. And consistency doesn't make good testimony service material, but might be the better story. Think about two kinds of architecture. The first kind gets attention because something went wrong and had to be repaired. The crack in the wall that was fixed. The structural problem that required dramatic intervention. People tell the story. The repair becomes part of the building's history. The second kind gets no attention because nothing went wrong. The building that stands for decades without a significant problem doesn't have a repair story. It has integrity, and buildings with the most repair stories are not the best built buildings. They're the ones that had the most to repair. Your life is the second kind of building, not the one with the dramatic repair story. The one that was built soundly enough that the dramatic repairs were never required. And the people in testimony service telling their repair stories are not further along than you. They just had more that needed fixing. And the steady, unremarkable, no crisis required faithfulness you've lived. That is not a lesser construction. That is what integrity looks like from the inside, before the walls get a chance to crack. Enoch walked with God. That's almost everything Scripture says about him. Walked with God. No dramatic story. No crisis survived. No moment of undeniable intervention that would make a testimony. Just walked with God for 300 years, and then God took him. The writer of Hebrews includes him in the Great Hall of Faith, not because of what he did, not because of what God did for him in a moment of visible intervention, because of the sustained, daily, unremarkable faithfulness of 300 years of walking. That's what made the list, not a testimony service story, a life. And then there's Joseph, who had a testimony that took 13 years of silence to become visible. 13 years of faithfulness with no dramatic intervention, no voice from heaven explaining the plan. No sign that what he was doing mattered. Just the quiet, invisible, unacknowledged faithfulness of someone who kept going without a story to tell. And then the story became visible all at once. And it was larger than anything that could have happened on a shorter timeline. Your testimony may be the kind that takes time to become visible. Not because God isn't working, because what he's building takes longer to see. The faithfulness you've been living in the meantime, that might be the story. So here's what I want to say to the version of you that goes home from testimony service still with nothing specific to point to. You're not someone God forgot to show up for. You are someone whose testimony doesn't fit in 3 minutes. You're not the person in the room with the least to say. You are the person whose story requires a longer format to tell. Because what God has been doing in your life, the steady holding, the quiet maintaining, the invisible strengthening of something that has never dramatically broken. That story doesn't have a climax yet. It has sustained faithfulness. It has years of showing up without visible reward. It has a life that continued well, not because nothing tried to break it, but because something held it. And that something is the same God who showed up for everyone else in the room, showing up for you in the format your life required. Not the dramatic one, the consistent one. And consistent presence is not a lesser testimony. It's the testimony of someone whose life has been held so carefully that the breaking was never required. You don't have nothing. You have something harder to see and more significant to have. A life that God has been quietly inside of for years. Without announcement, without the climax, without the story that fits the format. Just present, the way Enoch knew. The way Joseph discovered on the other side of 13 years. Before you go, type these words in the comments. My faithfulness is my testimony, not as a consolation for not having the other kind, as the recognition that what you've been living, the ordinary, unremarkable, no crisis required kind, is itself the evidence of a God who has been with you every unremarkable day, the whole time.